We don't invite beggars. That's what my mother said to me, out loud, at my sister's wedding, in front of maybe 60 people who had just watched me walk in wearing the dress I had bought, the heels I had saved for, holding a gift I had wrapped at midnight after a double shift. 60 people, including my sister's new in-laws, who had flown in from out of state, including a coworker of mine named James, who I hadn't known was on the guest list until I spotted him standing near the bar, frozen, staring at me with that particular look people get when they've witnessed something they cannot unhear. I want to tell you how I got there. Not just to the wedding. I mean to that moment in my life. The moment where those words landed and somehow didn't break me. That's the part worth understanding, because 6 months before that wedding, those same words would have leveled me. I would have stood there in my emerald green dress and quietly dissolved. But a lot had happened in 6 months. A lot had changed in me, quietly and without fanfare, and I had no idea until that moment that the change had actually taken hold. So let me go back to the beginning, back to before the wedding, before the money, before I understood what I was actually dealing with. I grew up in a house where things were tight, not desperate, but precarious enough that we all developed habits around scarcity. My parents worked inconsistently. There were good stretches and bad ones, and the bad ones had a way of bleeding into everything. The heat being turned off in February, the phone going quiet on certain days, the sense that our family was always one unexpected expense away from a crisis. I was the oldest by 3 years. That came with a specific, unspoken set of responsibilities that nobody ever named directly, but everyone understood. You help. You make yourself useful. You figure it out on your own rather than adding to the pile of problems. You do not, under any circumstances, become someone else's burden. So I made sure I wasn't. By 17, I had my first job, evenings and weekends at a grocery store. By 19, I was covering my own phone, my own clothes, my own application fees for college. I didn't resent it. That's a critical thing for you to understand, because this story could easily be told as the story of a resentful eldest child, and that's not what it is. I was proud of it. I genuinely believed, with the whole uncomplicated heart of a kid who hadn't yet been given reason to think otherwise, that self-sufficiency was something worth being proud of. That working hard would eventually be recognized. That the people who watched you build your life, piece by piece, out of your own effort, would see it and love you more for it. I moved out at 22, right after I graduated. Took a small apartment I could barely afford, with a roommate I barely knew. Started climbing whatever ladder I could get my hands on. Nothing dramatic, no startup, no lucky break. Just showing up early and staying late. Saying yes to projects other people passed on. Taking notes in meetings and actually acting on them afterward. I got promoted. Got promoted again. Started putting real money away for the first time in my life. Not a lot, but consistently, month after month. I built something that was entirely mine. Not inherited, not handed to me, not built on anyone else's foundation. Mine. And I was, in a quiet way, deeply proud of it. My family noticed the stability before they noticed the specifics. My mother started calling more often. My sister Renee, 3 years younger and someone I had drifted from through most of our 20s, suddenly wanted to meet for lunch and actually showed up when we planned it. My father, who had a long-standing habit of disappearing for months at a time and then reappearing as though no time had passed, texted me twice in 1 month just to check in. I read all of it as growth, as our family finally finding its footing after a chaotic decade, as the beginning of something better. I should have paid closer attention to the pattern. The requests started small, as they always do. Could I spot my mother a few hundred until her direct deposit cleared? Of course. Could I help Renee cover first and last month's rent when she moved in with her boyfriend? She'd pay me back by the end of the quarter? Absolutely. Could I look into flights for a family trip? Just put it on my card since mine had a better rate and they'd sort me out? No problem. I said yes to all of it without hesitation, without calculation, without a single second thought. Because I could afford to help, and because they were my family, and because somewhere in me I still believed that generosity within a family was just another word for love made practical. I was not paid back, not fully, and not consistently. Money would trickle in, $40 here, a Venmo for $80 there, always with an accompanying explanation I was expected to receive graciously and without follow-up. Renee was in a rough patch at work. My mother had an unexpected car repair, and anyway, she had been so stressed lately. My father had never been great with finances, and we all knew that, didn't we? I did know that. I just hadn't yet understood what it meant that knowing it had become my responsibility to absorb. The engagement announcement came on a Sunday afternoon. A phone call from Renee, voice bright and slightly breathless, telling me she had met someone named Derek, that they'd been together 8 months, and that he had proposed the week before on a hiking trail upstate. I was genuinely happy for her. Completely, uncomplicated happy. I asked how he proposed, what the ring looked like, how long she'd known this was serious. She laughed the whole way through. We were on the phone for almost an hour. She said the wedding would be something small, immediate family, and close friends, and that of course I'd be there. Of course. I hung up and sat with that warm feeling for a while. My little sister was getting married. That was a good thing, a genuinely good thing. 3 weeks later, my mother called to let me know the wedding would actually be 200 guests, that a venue had been booked at a vineyard about 40 minutes outside the city, that a caterer had been selected, that florals had already been discussed, that the combined cost of all of it was somewhere in the range of $40,000. She said this last part the way people say expensive numbers when they want you to feel the weight of them. Slowly, with a pause afterward. Derek's parents are contributing generously, she said carefully, but Renee was really hoping you'd want to help, as the big sister, as family. I asked how much they had in mind. She said without hesitation, $8,000. $8,000. Nearly a quarter of my annual savings at that point in my life. For a wedding I hadn't been consulted about, for a venue that had already been booked, for a couple whose combined income I happened to know exceeded mine because Renee had not been subtle about mentioning Derek's salary in the early months of their relationship. He made good money. Derek made genuinely good money. I told my mother I needed to think about it. She said she understood completely, and then spent the next 9 minutes explaining, in increasingly elaborate and emotionally layered detail, what this day meant to Renee, how this was a once-in-a-lifetime moment, how family shows up for each other during moments like this, how the gift of a sister's support cannot be replaced by anything Derek's family could contribute, because it isn't the same as having your own people behind you. The phrase shows up for each other appeared 4 times. I counted. I told her again that I needed to think about it. What I needed actually was to sit alone in my apartment and be completely honest with myself for the first time in a long time. Not about the wedding specifically, but about the pattern I had been inside of for years and had been consistently choosing not to name directly. I made a list. Not metaphorically. An actual list in my notes app, sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night, going back through bank statements and old messages and Venmo histories. It took me 2.5 hours. I went back 7 years. I included everything, the loans that were never repaid, the trips I had put on my card, the emergencies I had covered, the times I had quietly stepped in, because no one else was going to and I could, so I did. The total was just under $22,000. I sat with that number for a long time. $22,000 across 7 years. Money I had earned working doubles, skipping vacations, eating rice and beans for a week after a car repair, so I could still make rent and still have something left over to give when someone needed it. Money I had handed over quietly and without conditions, because I had believed, genuinely, earnestly believed, that it was building something. Not just helping in the moment, but building a foundation of trust and reciprocity and love that would eventually mean something. That eventually, if something happened to me, these same people would show up. That the account of goodwill I was funding would be there when I needed to make a withdrawal. The account was empty. I had been the only one making deposits for 7 years. I called my mother 2 days later and told her, as calmly and clearly as I could, that I wasn't able to contribute $8,000 to the wedding, that I wanted to give Renee a meaningful gift and be fully present on her day, but that this level of contribution wasn't something I was in a position to do. She received this information with 4 seconds of silence and then a very specific kind of disappointment. Not the grief of someone whose heart is broken, but the cold displacement of someone whose plan has been disrupted. There is a difference. I had learned to recognize it. She said she would let Renee know. Renee called that evening. The conversation was not kind. She said she had expected more from me, that I always made things about money, that Derek's family was already doing so much, and it was genuinely embarrassing that her own sister couldn't step up for something this important. I let her say all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I loved her and that I was very much looking forward to celebrating her wedding. She hung up without saying goodbye. The weeks between that phone call and the wedding were strange. On the surface, things were quiet. My mother sent warm, innocuous messages, memes, and links to recipes, the performative maintenance of normalcy. But underneath everything was a tension I had never quite felt before. Not the hot, anxious tension of a fight that hasn't happened yet, but something colder. The tension of a decision that had been made and couldn't be unmade. I had said no. For the first time in 7 years, I had said a real, firm, non-negotiable no. And I was discovering that the people in my life did not quite know what to do with me now that I had. I told exactly no one in my family what I had found in those bank statements. The $22,000 stayed between me and the Notes app on my phone. That was deliberate. I knew that producing it would be treated as an attack, as an act of aggression, rather than an accounting of reality. And I wasn't interested in a fight. I was interested in something much quieter and much more lasting. I was interested in finally seeing my situation clearly and deciding what I was going to do with what I saw. What I decided was this: I was going to the wedding. I was going to show up beautifully and graciously. I was going to be the kind of sister and daughter who demonstrates love through presence rather than through money. And I was going to let the day be about Renee, because whatever had happened and whatever would happen, she was my sister, and she was getting married, and I could hold that good thing separately from everything else. I bought a dress in emerald green, fitted through the waist and flaring slightly at the knee. Not expensive, but striking. I had my hair done the morning of, something I almost never splurged on, and I sat in that chair for 2 hours and let myself be taken care of for once. I wrapped the gift I'd been quietly arranging for weeks. A pair of custom illustrated prints for their new home, drawn from a description Renee had once given me of the view from the window of her first apartment, which she had said was the most beautiful thing she had ever woken up to. She had mentioned it once in passing 2 years earlier. I had remembered. I had the artist render it from both angles, the morning light version and the evening one. I wrote a card that said simply that I hoped every home she ever lived in felt as good as that first view. I was proud of the gift. I was proud of myself, actually, in a way I hadn't been proud of myself in a while. Not for anything dramatic, just for showing up whole, for making something beautiful out of a situation that had been trying to make me small. The venue was everything the budget implied. A restored barn at the edge of a working vineyard, strung with lights inside and out. Ceremony in an open meadow with the hills behind it and the late afternoon sky going gold. It was genuinely stunning. I arrived a few minutes before the ceremony started, found my seat in the third row, and spent the next hour watching my sister marry a man who looked at her the way people look at something they still cannot believe belongs to them. I cried. I meant the tears completely. The cocktail hour was held outside on the terrace while the bridal party did photographs. That's where I found James. My coworker, 2 departments over, someone I liked and respected and had not expected to see there. Turns out his wife had gone to college with Renee, a connection I hadn't known about. We stood at the edge of the terrace with our drinks and talked about nothing in particular. A project at work, the drive out, whether the barn had been converted recently or had always been an event space. It was easy. It felt normal. And then my mother appeared. She was wearing a champagne blazer and looked genuinely beautiful. She'd always dressed well for occasions. She walked toward us with an expression I had known my entire life. Something that sits just between warmth and warning. Something that could tip either direction, depending on how the next few seconds unfolded. She stopped. She looked at me. She looked at James. She looked back at me. And then she said it. We didn't invite beggars like you. The air around us changed immediately. I watched it happen. The couple to our left, who had been mid-laugh, went still. A woman behind me stopped talking. James, beside me, became very, very quiet in the specific way people become quiet when they have witnessed something they weren't supposed to witness and do not yet know how to process. I looked at my mother for a moment. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it matters. It wasn't the hot rush of humiliation I might have felt a year or 2 earlier. It wasn't even shock. What I felt was something much quieter and much colder. A kind of deep, clarifying stillness. Like something that had been blurry for a long time had just snapped into focus. I said, I think I misheard you. She did not take the exit I had offered her. She said, You heard me. I nodded once. I turned to James and said quietly that I was going to find Renee before the dinner seating. Then I walked away from my mother in front of a crowd of people who had just seen her say what she said, and I found a quiet corner near the entrance doors, and I stood there, alone, for 2 full minutes. I was not going to make a scene at my sister's wedding. I had decided that before I arrived and the decision held, even now, I was not going to cry in a way that someone would notice. I was not going to find my mother and demand an explanation in the middle of a reception. I was going to finish this evening with dignity, and then I was going to go home, and then I was going to figure out what happened next. Dinner was fine in the way that things are fine when everyone is working hard to not acknowledge something that happened. I was seated at a table with Derek's cousins, who were warm and funny and knew nothing about what had transpired on the terrace. I ate. I drank 1 glass of wine, slowly. I watched Renee and Derek cut the first dance short because they were both laughing too hard to stay and hold, and something in me felt, genuinely and separately from everything else, happy for her. Whatever this day had become for me did not have to diminish what it was for her. I could hold both things at once. I was learning to hold both things at once. I left before the cake, slipped out during a slow song when the floor was full and no one was watching the exits, hugged two people, said something vague about an early morning, and got into my car. Drove the 40 minutes home in the dark with the radio off. That night, I sat on my couch for a long time and thought about nothing in particular, which is what I always do when something important has happened, and I need to let it settle before I try to turn it into a thought. The dress was hanging over my closet door. The gift was still in my car. Renee had been swept up after the ceremony, and I hadn't found the right moment to give it to her. I sat there and I breathed. I called my therapist first thing the next morning. I had started seeing her about 9 months earlier, initially for what I had described as work stress. It took her 4 sessions to gently redirect me toward what was actually happening. We had spent the better part of those 9 months dismantling a set of beliefs I had been carrying so long I had mistaken them for personality. Beliefs about what love looks like when it's built on obligation rather than choice, about what it means to be needed versus what it means to be valued, and why I had spent so long confusing the two, about the difference between generosity that comes from abundance and generosity that comes from fear. Fear that if I stopped giving, the relationship would reveal itself to have been conditional all along. The relationship had just revealed itself to have been conditional all along. Right there on the terrace in a champagne blazer in front of 60 people. When I told my therapist what had happened, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "What did that tell you that you didn't already know?" It was exactly the right question, because the honest answer was nothing. I had already known. The $22,000 had told me. The unreturned calls had told me. The $8,000 ask had told me. The wedding had just removed the last thin layer of ambiguity I had been maintaining. Carefully, effortfully, because facing what was underneath it had felt like more than I was ready for. I was ready now. What followed was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story that people tell where the aftermath is clean and cinematic. A decisive confrontation, a tearful acknowledgement from the people who hurt you, a clear moment of resolution where everyone learns something and the credits roll. That isn't what happened. What happened was much quieter and much more ongoing, and in some ways harder because of it. I stopped being available in the way I had always been available. Not suddenly, not as a punishment, not with a speech or an ultimatum. I just stopped responding at the speed that had always been expected of me. Messages that had previously received a reply within the hour now waited a day, sometimes 2. Requests for money were met with warmth and a clear no. I told my mother in a short and measured phone call about 2 weeks after the wedding that I was taking some space and that I would be in touch when I was ready. She asked if I was angry with her. I told her I wasn't, which was mostly true. I was something more complex than angry. Anger would have been easier to carry than what I was actually feeling, which was a kind of grief for the version of the family I had always believed we were building toward, for all the years I had spent funding a dynamic that was never going to become what I needed it to be. Renee texted me 3 times over the next 2 months, once to send a thank you note that was genuine and lovely, and that I responded to with warmth. Once to ask if something was wrong, which I answered with care and honesty. Not accusation, not a catalog of grievances, just an honest statement that I was doing some reflecting and that I hoped we could talk properly soon. And once, 8 weeks after the wedding, to tell me that she had spoken with our mother and that she thought I was perhaps overreacting to what had happened, and that maybe I could consider the level of stress everyone had been under during the planning period. I read that message several times. I thought about it for a long time. Not just what it said, but what it meant that she had sent it. That her first substantive response to learning what her mother had said to me in front of a room full of people at her wedding was to suggest that my response to it was the problem. I thought about the version of myself who would have accepted that reframe, who would have said, "You're right, I'm sorry, I'll let it go, let's just move on." I had been that version of myself for years. She had served everyone except me. I wrote back. I told Renee that I wasn't angry, that I wished she and Derek every happiness in the world, and that I hoped we would eventually find our way to a relationship that felt more honest for both of us. Every word of that was true. None of it was a performance. The months that followed were, in the most unexpected way, the quietest of my adult life. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't. But because I had finally stopped working so hard to hold something in place that didn't want to stay. All that energy I had been pouring into availability, into responsiveness, into giving and anticipating and softening and managing, I got it back. Slowly and all at once, like a dam that has been leaking for years finally letting go. I did things I had been putting off. I took a long weekend trip I had been postponing for 18 months. I signed up for a course I had been circling since the previous year. I spent money I had earned on things I wanted without calculating what I might need to cover for someone else next month. I had dinner with friends I had been seeing less frequently than I wanted to. I called people back who I actually wanted to call back, and I let the other calls go to voicemail without the old accompanying guilt. I started to understand what it felt like to live inside my own life rather than at the edge of someone else's. About 8 months after the wedding, a voicemail appeared from my mother. Not a text. A voicemail, her actual voice, which felt significant enough that I listened to it 3 times before I did anything else. She said she had been thinking about what happened at the reception, that she wasn't entirely sure what had come over her, that she hoped I knew she didn't mean it the way it sounded. There was a long pause in the middle of it, where I could hear her breathing. There was no apology in those words, not precisely, but there was something adjacent to one, something that sounded like a person beginning, however incompletely and imperfectly, to reckon with what they had done. I waited a week before I called back. That week wasn't about punishment or leverage. I needed that week to decide what I actually wanted, not what I was supposed to want as a good daughter, not what the narrative required for a clean resolution, not what would make everyone else more comfortable. What I actually wanted. What I wanted, I discovered, was something smaller and more possible than what I had spent years trying to build. I didn't want the big family warmth I had imagined. I didn't want everything explained and apologized for and set right. I wanted something quieter, an acknowledgement that what had happened, and a different kind of relationship going forward, one with clearer edges, one where what I gave was what I chose to give, not what I gave in order to keep the peace. I called her back. The conversation was short and careful. I told her the voicemail had meant something to me. I told her that I needed things to be different going forward, not as a threat, not as a demand, just as an honest statement of where I stood. I was not going to be the person I had been, financially, emotionally, in terms of what I absorbed without naming it. That was simply not available anymore to anyone. She said she understood. I can't tell you with certainty that she fully did, But the conversation happened, and it was real, and it opened a door that I had genuinely wondered might be permanently closed. We talk now, occasionally. The conversations are shorter than they used to be, but more honest. Renee and I have reached something like a careful detente. We are in each other's lives, at a distance that allows for warmth, without the performance of closeness we don't yet have. It's progress. In families like mine, progress doesn't look like resolution. It looks like new limits being quietly, consistently respected. There are things I know now that I didn't know before all of this, and I want to say them plainly because I think they are the most useful thing I have to offer from any of it. The first is this. The moment my mother called me a beggar at my sister's wedding was not the worst thing that happened to me in that season of my life. The worst thing was the $22,000 and 7 years of belief that generosity without limits was another name for love. That being needed was another name for being valued. That if you worked hard enough and gave enough and showed up enough, the people who benefited from all of that would eventually see you clearly and treat you accordingly. I had given away the most irreplaceable things I had: time, money, energy, self-respect, in exchange for belonging that turned out to be contingent on my continued willingness to give. That's not love. I know that now in my body, not just in my head. The second thing is this. Setting a limit doesn't make you cold. I was genuinely afraid of that for a long time. That if I stopped absorbing what was being put on me, I would turn into something harder, something diminished, something that had survived at the cost of its own softness. That isn't what happened. What happened is that I stopped being tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a long week, but the structural, bone-deep fatigue of someone who has been performing a version of themselves that was never true. The version that called tolerance patience, that called fear of losing people love, that showed up to a barn on a vineyard in an emerald green dress and stood in a crowd of strangers and felt a sharp word land and did not shatter. That version of me had been exhausted for years. Letting her rest was the kindest thing I ever did for myself. The dress still hangs in my closet. I haven't worn it again, but I haven't gotten rid of it either, and I think about why that is sometimes. Maybe because some experiences don't resolve into clean lessons. Maybe they just sit in the room with you, and you think about them differently as time passes, and eventually you realize you've stopped bracing for the weight of them. I am not angry. I want to say that one more time because I know how this kind of story can read from the outside. And I know what it can look like when someone recounts their family's failures in this much detail. But the dominant emotion in me, when I think about all of it now, is not anger. It's something closer to relief. The relief of someone who has finally put down a very heavy thing they had been carrying for a very long time and looked at it on the ground and understood that they never had to pick it back up. I said no at the right time. Later than I should have, maybe, but exactly on time for who I needed to become. What I haven't told you yet is what the weeks leading up to the wedding actually looked like from the inside, because those weeks matter. They are the part of the story that doesn't make it into the highlight reel, the part where nothing dramatic happens, where I went to work and came home and ate dinner and watched television and went to sleep, while underneath all of that, something in me was very slowly and very quietly shifting into a new position. I had started seeing my therapist, as I mentioned, about 9 months before the wedding. What I hadn't told you is what the early sessions looked like, because they didn't look the way I expected therapy to look. I expected to go in, describe my situation, receive some organized framework for understanding it, and leave feeling better. What actually happened is that for the first 3 sessions, I talked almost entirely about work. And then, in the fourth session, she asked me very gently whether the patterns I was describing at work, the overgiving, the difficulty saying no to requests, the compulsive need to prove my value through output, were patterns I recognized from anywhere else in my life. I said I'd have to think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks and then came back and said, yes, I recognize them. I had been running the same operating system my entire adult life, and the workplace was just the most recent place it had installed itself. The original installation was older. It went back to being 17 in a house where things were tight, and one of the unspoken rules was that you did not add to the pile. You absorbed, you contributed, you made yourself worth keeping. My therapist did not diagnose me with anything or tell me what to do. What she did over months of careful, patient conversation was help me see the architecture of something I had been living inside so long I had stopped being able to perceive its shape. I could see it now. I could see how the whole thing had been constructed, and I could see the costs. And I could see that I had a choice I had never quite understood I was being given. I had been operating as though these were fixed features of my personality: the giving, the absorbing, the inability to put my own needs first without feeling like I was doing something wrong. She helped me understand that they were decisions I had been making, that decisions can be revised. That understanding was what I was carrying into the wedding. It wasn't armor exactly, more like the knowledge that I had armor if I needed it, that I wouldn't dissolve, that whatever happened, I was somebody now who could be in a difficult situation without it defining her, without it pulling her back into all the old patterns she had been so carefully, effortfully stepping away from. When my mother said what she said, on that terrace, with those people around us, the armor held. What I haven't described, because I wanted to get to it properly, is the moment that came after. Not immediately after, not the quiet corner by the entrance doors, not the dinner at the cousin's table, but later. About 2 hours into the reception, when I had decided I was going to leave soon and was making my circuit of quiet goodbyes, I found myself alone for a moment near the bar, waiting for the bartender to finish with another guest. And Derek appeared beside me. I want to be clear. Derek had no idea what had happened on the terrace. He had been across the venue with the photographer when it happened, and no one, as far as I know, had told him. He simply appeared beside me because he was the groom, and the groom makes his way through the room. And I happened to be where he happened to be for 90 seconds. He said, and I'm going to try to get this close to right because it mattered. He said that Renee had told him a little about our family dynamics, that she had given him some background on things, and that he wanted me to know, personally, that he was glad I was there, that it meant something to Renee even if she hadn't said it the right way, that he hoped we'd get to know each other better over the years ahead. He said it with the straightforward sincerity of someone who had no idea they were stepping into something complicated. I looked at him and thought, this person is good. My sister has found someone genuinely good. And then I thanked him, and he moved on to the next cluster of guests, and I stood there for a moment holding the small and genuine gift of that exchange. That's the thing about complicated situations. They very rarely present as all one thing. The wedding was not only a wound, it was also my sister marrying someone who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. It was those hillside lights at dusk. It was Derek's cousins who laughed at my jokes. It was the dance floor filling up with people who were uncomplicated in their joy. I could hold the wound and the beauty at the same time, and doing that was not weakness or denial. It was just accuracy, a full accounting. The same clarity I had applied to the bank statements now applied to the evening itself. I drove home, as I said, in silence. What I didn't mention is what I did when I got there, because it's small, but I think it's telling. I changed out of the dress. I hung it carefully on the outside of my closet door instead of inside it, which is what I do with things I want to be able to look at for a while before I put them away. I took off the heels and left them by the door. I made myself a cup of tea I barely drank. And then I sat down at my kitchen table with my phone and I scrolled, slowly, back through the Notes app to the list I had made weeks earlier. I read through it, all of it. All the dates and amounts and explanations and partial repayments and the things I had told myself at the time to make each one make sense. I read it the way you read something you've written and then put away, with the slight distance of time, surprised by the specificity of your own past self. $22,000. 7 years. An average of slightly more than $3,000 a year. Paid out in increments small enough that each one felt manageable. Each one felt like the kind of thing a person who loved her family would simply do. I deleted the list. Not because it didn't matter. It did matter, and I wasn't going to forget it. But because I didn't need it anymore. It had served its purpose. It had shown me what I needed to see. In the months after the wedding, something else happened that I haven't talked about yet. I started telling people, not as a confession or a complaint, but in the natural way that things come up when you're close to someone and they ask how you're doing and you decide to answer honestly. I told 2 friends who had known me for years. I told my roommate from that first apartment who I had stayed in touch with. I told a colleague I had grown genuinely close to over the previous year. What surprised me was how many of them recognized what I was describing. Not the specifics, not the exact amounts or the wedding or the particular geography of my family, but the shape of it, the overgiving, the confusion of love with obligation, the deep and somewhat exhausting need to make yourself valuable so that no one has a reason to leave. More than one person told me they were in the middle of some version of the same reckoning, that they had been the helper in their family, or the reliable one, or the one everyone called when things went wrong and never when things went right, that they had been trying to figure out what to do with the discovery that the reciprocity they had been waiting for was probably never coming. I found something unexpected in those conversations, solidarity that felt nothing like self-pity. We weren't sitting around being victims together. We were sitting around finally being honest together, which is a different thing, a better thing. There is one more thing I want to say, because I think it's the most important thing, and I want to get it right. I have thought many times since about why my mother said what she said. I have turned it over the way you turn over something you found on the ground that you're not sure what to do with, whether it was cruelty or carelessness, whether it was something that had been building for years and just chose the worst possible moment to surface, whether some part of her believed I had humiliated her by refusing to contribute, and this was the retaliation she had been quietly preparing. Whether she said it intending it as a joke that landed terribly, or whether in that moment she meant every word. I don't know. I have made my peace with not knowing. What I know is that it happened, and that it happened in front of witnesses, and that no version of any explanation makes it something other than what it was. A moment in which my own mother looked at me, in a dress I had bought myself, holding a gift I had made with care, at an event I had attended with full and generous intention, and chose to diminish me publicly. That happened. It cannot be unverified. And it happened to the wrong version of me. The version she was expecting. The version who would have stood there in stunned silence, and then found a way to apologize for her own distress, who would have spent the rest of the evening managing everyone's discomfort, including her mother's, who would have driven home and cried and called her the next day to smooth it over. That version had quietly left about 8 months earlier. The version she got was someone who had been doing a lot of difficult unglamorous work. Someone who had sat in a therapist's office and looked unflinchingly at the patterns she had inherited and chosen. Someone who had run a 7-year accounting of her own generosity and understood finally what it had been in service of. Someone who had decided with full deliberateness that she was going to spend the rest of her life being as genuinely loving as she had always wanted to be, but toward people who showed up in her actual life, not just in her imagination of what her family might become. I walked away from my mother on that terrace, and I did not look back, and I did not feel small, and I did not spend the rest of the evening being afraid of what came next. I felt, underneath everything else, underneath the grief and the absurdity of the whole situation, something that I have since come to recognize as the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has finally, after a very long time, acted in full alignment with who she is. That's what I took home from that wedding. Not the wound, though the wound was real, but the knowledge that I was exactly who I needed to be in the moment that tested it. You can't buy that. You can't inherit it or borrow it or have it handed to you. You have to build it slowly out of the 1,000 small decisions you make about how you're going to treat yourself when no one is watching and no one is keeping score. I had been building it for 8 months. Turns out that was exactly enough time.